Okay. So thank you again, every single one of you, for taking this time out of your day to join in and talk about and learn about this really important topic. I am so excited to have Lisa Harris here with us. I'll let her tell you about who she is and what she does here at UVA. I don't want to leave any of the good stuff out. So thank you for being here. And thank you, Lisa, for being here to teach us this today. I'm going to let you take it away.
Okay, well, again, Samantha, thank you for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here. It's so funny, I realized I did a slide that doesn't even have my name on it. So my name is Lisa Harris, and I am a senior learning and development consultant here at UVA under talent management, which is human resources. I've been here at UVA for 5 years. But my career began because I worked for Ford Motor Company. That's the actual corporation out of Dearborn, Michigan. For about 20 years, I did everything from sales and marketing to buying and selling dealers, to developing curriculum and training, and to running sales organizations. And then I left to go work for American Express. And then after that, I started my own business. And then sadly, my mom passed away and I needed to leave New Jersey and have a little bit of a change. And so I have been here at UVA ever since and have enjoyed this time here at UVA. The work of inclusion, as I call it, primarily across all spectrums of all of our lives, has been really important to me because we are what I call we are intersectional, right? We have multiple spaces for which we sit. And the subject of age, which still includes all the diversity, all the issues of equity, is one of the fastest growing spaces and places of age discrimination, but is also a great challenge for the multiple generations that exist when we think about caregiving, when we think about ethnicities, when we think about our young people and the impact that caring for older aging people may be. And so our work as people who think about it as inclusion is how do we take care of everyone? So what does age have to do with it? It has everything to do with it. And so today we're going to spend time kind of growing in awareness, thinking about some things that we can agree to do, and then actually taking action. I said to Samantha, I am more interested in having a dialogue with you than I am necessarily into slides. I probably have more slides than we have time. So if there's any questions or comments, by all means, feel free to just jump in. So, and here we go. So again, my goal here is to talk about the 5 generations in the workplace, which I'll get to after some data, some of the characteristics of those generations, and then the beginning, as I said, we're looking for awareness, agreement, and action, which is that AAA process. So I thought it'd be interesting to just share some Pew research with you, just for those of you who, as someone said to me, geek out on data, then this might be really of interest to you. So Pew actually says just 10 years ago, the share of the elderly in the population was about 13%. Today, it's about 16%, and Pew Research Center projects that by 2050, it'll be 22%. So we have an aging population. Today, there are about 45% more children under the age of 18 than there are people 65 and older. And well before 2050, adults 65 and over will outnumber the children. So our aging population is something to really pay attention to. And there will be 2.5 times as many people 85 and older than there are today. So again, just to think about our generations and the population that we're managing. Pew Research also talks about that by 2050, Americans will also be more diverse. And so we're having a decline of non-Hispanic whites, and then we're seeing Latinx is growing at 60%. We're looking at Asians who are actually doubling in population, and then the Afro-Caribbean Black community is at 30%. And that immigrants and their children account for about 26% of the US population today. And by 2050, that'll be 34%. So when we talk about generations and bridging, it is also an issue of multi-ethnic generations who are actually working in this country. So important, not just that we have an aging population, but we also have populations because people coming into the country are coming in from various ages as well. So really important to think about the whole process of aging as a multi-ethnic opportunity. Pew goes on to talk about a number of very old people. And the reason they talk about this is because as a result, as you all know, there's like millions of baby boomers who are retiring every day. And very excited about their opportunity to depart after their years of service. But in some cases, some of them are staying a little longer because there's been a financial impact, things from like the 2008, 2009 financial crisis. But as we look at that, because some of them are staying longer and we also have an aging population, we also have to consider that there's a population of people who will have to spend more time and may need more care. For those of you who, are balancing, a parent and maybe even a child, or just one or the other, this is really important. And he goes on to talk about 10 million Americans over the age of 65 rely on some form of unpaid care from family and friends. And people wonder, why is that so important? Well, when we think about the number of people who have come out of the workplace in these multiple generations to actually care for their families, this is also having an impact. So we have people who are not working, but their job is to actually care for an aging parent or a child for whatever those reasons might be. So that's having an impact on generation, on work, on availability. The number is certain to grow over the next few decades with a large impact on the supply in the workforce. And again, we're talking about people who are not getting paid to take care of their families. So you have families living together off of maybe either Social Security, retirement, or something else that they may have to take care of. About 25% of all caregivers of elderly are their children. And so when we think about generations in the workplace, we also have to consider that people are caregivers for people at various ages. And so we have all of these things taking place when we think about what's going on with the generations and who we're actually managing. Right. And to think that children are the primary people who are taking care. Children, for most people, we think, oh, that's probably a millennial or it's a Gen X. But we are finding that there are a lot of children who are much younger who are actually taking care of their parents. And in some cases, under the age of 18, especially after COVID, right? So all of this is important when you start thinking about who shows up in the workplace and the life experiences that they've had and who have they supported or who has supported them. And then they talk about the change in demographics because baby boomers grew up probably with 3 or 4 siblings, right? But they themselves are only having like 2 children. And so if you look at that thing, it says the ratio of individuals over the age of 85 to those in peak caregiving years of 45 to 65 is projected to increase from 1 to 7 to 1 in 3 by 2050. So that is likely to increase the demand on institutional care. And we also have a demand for care when we think about people with accessibility or disability issues as well. So all of these numbers and all of this information is impacting this issue about how we're working in the various generations. So, and again, this is a modified presentation that normally takes 3 hours. So that's why I said probably have more slides than we have time. But this is the breakdown for the workplace generations. And I will share with all of you, I am a fan of what they call cusping. And cusping is, if you look at 45, 65, 80, 2000, 2012, and so forth, that if you look at 80, 65, and 45, it's called cusping. So you get to pick your generations. There are multiple lists of years out in the workplace. They give you generations. You'll find some that actually overlap. But for many of you, you may be familiar with the traditionalist or the silent generation. Baby boomers, very common. Gen X, millennials, and Gen Y. Then Gen Z or iGen. And iGen, for those who may not be familiar, is Gen Z is one of the unique generations that decided they wanted to have a second name and it be related to technology. So iGen is related to technology for them, intelligence. And then the latest generation that has showed up is called Generation Alpha. And Generation Alpha, as they start to analyze more of these generations, they will add in more letters. So I'm sure the next one will be Generation Beta. But what's even more fascinating is that they've actually gone back to the 1800s to label generations. So they go back as far as like 1848 to label generations. And there are generations called Cavalier, there's generations called Lost. So a whole lot of generational work so people understand the impact that has taken place for the various generations. So what I thought I would do is jump right in and kind of share with all of you some background on the generations just so that you had some idea. But as always, in a moment of fun, does anyone come off mute? Does anyone recognize any of these people in the traditionalist or silent generation? You can just shout it out if you recognize them.
Tina Turner,
Yes.
Dick Clark,
Judy
Yes.
Dench,
Yes.
Tina Turner,
Mhm.
Albert King,
Robert Redford,
Robert Redford is right.
Judy Dench,
B.B. King,
It is B.B. King. Yep. And the woman in the far corner is Celia Cruz. Celia Cruz is known for her music within the Latin community. And I won't go through all of them because the pictures start to get to be real long, but that's the basic premise. So when we think about the traditional generation and we think about what I just talked about caregivers, the traditional generation, they represent about 5% of the population today. This generation's narrative is around the Great Depression, World War II, Pearl Harbor. And so when we think about this generation, for those of you who still have parents, grandparents, great-grandparents in this generation, for those of you who go places and you see some of these people may still be in the workplace and serving their institutions, be amazed. Just recently, there was some reward and recognition at the university for people who'd been here for 55 years. So 45, 50, and 55 years of service to the University of Virginia represent, just think about the impact of that. So this generation is all about logic. They don't like change. This is a generation that's considered to be very dedicated, very loyal. This is a generation that made sacrifices on behalf of going to war for their country. So they are country focused, community focused, and they value and respect rules. And so when we think about this generation and we think about how this generation, wherever they may be working, for those who are, or we think about what it means to care for this generation really values loyalty, really values discipline and logic, which for some people would be in contrast to what they perceive is true for other generations. And so this is really important when we're engaging in relationship with people who came through in this particular generation. The other thing is, if you're working with people in this generation, this is about building legacy because they worked really hard. They believe they trusted institutions. They believe that if they worked hard, they received what they were supposed to receive. They don't want a lot of feedback. They surely don't want it on the internet, on the phone. For them, it's if you're going to talk to them, have a face-to-face conversation. And for them, no news is good news, right? So we really want to make sure we're engaging them in a face-to-face manner. But again, don't waste their time if you have nothing that is of significance and value. So again, no news is good news. Don't just to speak to them. All right, baby boomers. Anybody recognize anybody here?
Oprah,
Yes.
Meryl Streep,
Yeah.
Larry Bird and Magic Johnson.
Very good. Very good.
Bob Marley,
Bob Marley. Very nice.
Bruce Willis,
Yes. Very good.
Magic
good.
Johnson,
Yes, Magic Johnson. Absolutely. Got Bill Nye, the science guy. The gentleman on the bottom, second to the end, when I worked at Ford, that's Alan Mullally's considered one of the best CEOs at Ford Motor Company. And the woman on the end is at one point in time, she's been knocked down, was actually considered the richest woman in the world out of Africa as it relates to oil. And so, all right, so let's talk about baby boomers a little bit. And hopefully you all recognize some of this in yourselves as I'm sharing all of this. But right now, the baby boomers represent about 21% of the population. And for them, their narratives fall under things such as Howdy Doody, the civil rights movement, this whole equality for women. We get into music like rock and roll and Woodstock and the Beatles and Elvis shaking his leg and causing conflict on national television. The first man on the moon. Then computers, and then we have yuppies, young urban professionals. And for anyone who still remembers Jiffy Pop, they still sell it at grocery stores on the lower level. And Jiffy Pop being one of those trademark things from that generation. When you think about baby boomers, unlike their parents, or grandparents who happen to be traditionalists. This is the first generation that starts to look at their individualness, like it's about me. What they're interested in is how are they going to live what has been defined the American dream, which is money, white picket fence, 2.5 kids, the dog, and all of these things that have defined success here in this country. So this generation is looking for more consumption. Now I want to say, because I say it often, not everybody fits every one of these characteristics, and depending on when you were raised, the reality is you might have more characteristics of your parents' generation or grandparents' generation than the ones that I'm showing you here. But when they did their assessment, this is the general assessment of what each is very tied to what each of these generations are. And so because the baby boomers show up as a generation that is looking to expand, to grow, and to be recognized for their contributions, titles are important to them, recognition is important to them, having a career where there's opportunity for them to grow or progress, having opportunities where they get to, maybe not, it's not a promotion right away, but it's an opportunity to have exposure and to grow in their role. For them, it's about competition and productivity. And of course, in this time period, we have more women who are showing up. So if you have someone on your team, again, not to generalize, in this category of baby boomers, given this description, the thing I would suggest to everybody is, what are you doing in terms of reward and recognition for this generation, right? How are they being recognized on your team? What, more importantly, are their values and what do they value, right? And so we think about, Aspire values from the UVA Health. So it's like, what are the values that you bring individually? What are the values that the team has? Well, what does this generation value that you can use as a way of recognizing and retaining them as part of a functioning team? And that's really important. And I'll put a pin in this and say, it's so important when we think about generations and we think about teams, are we clear about what it means to be a member of your team? And how do these generational assets show up to make your team more effective, achieve more of its goals, to problem solve maybe better than it did before, and understanding this about the generations actually does help and can actually make a difference. I think I saw something in the chat. Is that a question? Just want to make sure before not a question. Okay. Are there any questions about these generations so far? Everybody agree, recognize something about them that sounds familiar? Okay, good. Got the head nods. I appreciate that. All right. So this is Gen X. Again, not expecting everybody to recognize everyone, but does anyone recognize some people in this picture?
Selma Hayek.
Angelina Jolie.
Derek Jeter,
Yes, Derek Jeter.
Jennifer Aniston,
Yes.
Idris Alba.
Yes, I always jokingly say my husband. Yes, but not, yes. He's married now with kids. Yes, Mr. Hamilton. Absolutely. Yes.
Elma
let's see.
Hayek.
Selma Hayek, absolutely.
Chris Rock.
Yes. You guys are good. We could all go on trivia games together. We would win. All right. So for those of you who are Gen Xers, right now, Gen Xers are actually the smallest, even from traditionalists, in terms of the population. Is about 19% of the population is our Gen Xers. So this generation is actually categorized by the Challenger disaster, the Gulf War, we have the fall of communism. And now, because of this kind of need to progress, recognition, desire for consumption, and again, women and men entering the workplace, another moment of inclusion, diversity, and equity, we're starting to see, not the only reason, more divorces show up in this generation. This is a generation that used to get up and turn a dial on a television, but now is starting to have a remote. This is a generation that's seeing cable show up in its network. You have home computers showing up, the really big ones where you had multiple pieces for it. Again, video games for anybody who might remember, because this is my generation. Literally the screen was green and stuff used to pop off of it, right? So, and then the music changes. So now we are at this point where we have hip hop coming in, we have grunge music and so forth. But I hope what you're recognizing is between the last 3 generations, well, actually, I'm gonna ask all of you, just in cultural narrative, does anyone recognize any themes in cultural narratives? Anything standing out to you? I'm gonna pop back real quick just to see if you notice something. Okay, that's silent. That's baby boomer. And this is Gen X. Anybody notice anything?
Each group had a war around
Thank
it.
you. Yes, Ebony, absolutely, right? Every generation is actually experiencing a war. And most of those wars have been somewhere else, right? And so this is really important because it is the thing that no matter which way you put it, we have in common. So when we're talking about bridging a gap, we can all talk about having shared the pride and the recognition of having family or friends who served, and also the grief and loss for those who did not come home, right? So we are having a similar experience, even if it's showing up in these different generations. This generation is so unlike traditionalists and baby boomers, because this generation, due to divorce, due to watching parents or grandparents lose their job, no golden watches, retirements being lost, financial things taking place, the Generation X generation over time values freedom. They are self-reliant. These are the people who their parents put a set of keys around their neck, sent them to school, they got to come home, they made their own peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, they basically took care of themselves or their siblings. And again, this is more US based. I can't speak from a global perspective, but this is more US based. But this generation, because of watching grandparents and parents look and lose things, their trust in institutions and churches and government is not there. They are latchkey kids. Many people describe this generation as the people on your team who have something negative to say most of the time. They're asking the difficult question most of the time. They're the people who disagree most of the time. But the reality about this generation, if we think of it in a different perspective, is they're the generation that asks the difficult questions because they watch the institutions let go of family and friends, again, without the golden parachute. They've seen their churches show up with many events and things that happened in their churches that they could not believe their churches were engaged in or involved in. And they've watched the government in many ways, from every one of these wars to whatever the policies may be, not show up in a way that they felt that their government should show up. So they tend to ask the difficult questions, and they sometimes tend, again, to be perceived as negative, when in reality, what they're looking for is, if you look at that description at the bottom, they are looking for the answer. They need you to give them facts and figures. They're not just going to take your answer because you give it to them. They want to know where your data came from or what your research is that brings you to it. You can't just say, that old saying for some people, because I told you so. You need to give them data and facts so it makes sense. And this is the generation, again, that is rejecting authority. But this is the unique thing about this generation. This generation is loyal to people and not an organization. So think about your teams and think about what that means in terms of how, again, you set up your teams. So that means I may not be loyal to the University of Virginia. I might not even be loyal to an area for which I work. But if you can lead and build teams and create trust around values, I will stay here even if I have issues with the institution. I will stay here because I believe in you. And so this issue around building loyalty and connection is really important to this generation. And again, Generation X is unique because Generation X is a generation that is primarily taking care of parents and raising kids. And so they are trying to balance the complexity of caregiver on both sides, right? They are the generation, again, who is looking for wherever that, well, would like some support, but in reality are so used to being independent that they have no expectation of it. And so when you think about what it means to support a Gen Xer on your team, just think about all those individual kind of do it myself, can get it done, fairly independent, but also their need to have someone to be loyal to and connected to. So when we talk about that, this is where values really matter for the people who fit in this generation. I think it matters for all generations because we all have values, but really significant to this generation because they're looking to be loyal to somebody who they feel they can trust, someone who demonstrates respect, inclusion, and understanding, and embraces the value of the work that needs to get done as well. So this is really important for those people on your team, is about the loyalty to the people and not necessarily the organization. I see a whole bunch of things in the chat. I'm not sure if there's questions down there.
I am going to bring up, because it came up in the chat, and I know how you might be able to answer this because I know you're not the one obviously creating this narrative, right? But the question is around, especially 1965 to 1980, that home computer being part of the narrative, because it immediately came up like, wait, when were the computers? What was happening?
Yeah.
So how did that get determined? Or that was kind of the question there, is how is that defining? How is that part of it? Because it wasn't a widespread piece.
No, and actually, it's a really good question. And to the point, I didn't design this. When I read this, my assumption wasn't that it wasn't really home computers, but it was computers more than anything, because you had computers in various spaces. And so the acknowledgement that computers were coming into the space, I think is more of what it is. But I copied it just as it was, and it said home computers. But my own impression was that there were computers in other spaces and places that were more work related, not necessarily in one's home. That was my interpretation of it.
I have another question,
Yeah.
shouting out Sue, because it is a great question. Gen X has kind of had this term for them, slackers. So she asked, why is that a term that's used for where does that come from?
So that's a great question, because if you think about all the other descriptions of Gen X, slackers do not really fit. But part of that is because there's some perception that Gen Xers kind of step back every once in a while and they're like, hey, I've had enough. And so they kind of slack off, because the way I interpret it is because they're burnt out for the management of both sides of what they do. And to some people, that's like slacking. And I'm like, well, if I'm already working at 100%, if you think I need to do 200, I'm sure I look like I'm slacking. So I think some of it is unrealistic expectations, but that's that balance that literally they're slacking off, even though they're managing a zillion things in the process. It's a great question. And by the way, they probably need to slack off because their burnout factor is much higher than any other generation, because they're taking care of parents and children. Those are great questions. All right, millennials. Anybody recognize the folks in the millennial generation?
Michael Phelps.
Yes.
Trevor Noah.
Yes.
Miley Cyrus.
Yes.
Beyonce.
Sisters.
Gotta get Beyonce in there. World tour.
Ryan Gosling, I think that is.
Yeah, I call that my quadruple Disney group, because every one of them were part of the Disney group when they got started, and look at where they all are today. So yeah, and again, just multiple groups of people on his list. So I'm gonna move into the description. There are about 22% of the population today are millennials. And no surprise to most of you, the millennials are categorized as the technology revolution. Literally everything just opening up. And you had Transformers, you had Tickle Me Elmo. Most people just remember Elmo, but their Elmo actually laughed. Of course, cell phones and the use of them Google showing up. There's iPads. I'm gonna skip over. You had the Spice Girls show up. We had people reading books that were 500 pages long with Harry Potter. But the critical thing is this is the year for which, again, war, but this time, along with the Oklahoma City bombing, this is terrorism on our own soil. So the generation, in many cases, that got to see it and experienced it. And so this generation, along with, unfortunately, and it's true for the next generation, this issue of violence on our home soil, violence, whether it was a terrorism attack or violence with all these shootings, that this generation is very conscious and aware of all that is taking place. Now, I didn't talk about the heroes and villains of the past generations, but I will for millennials, because normally there's this video that gets shown, but the gentleman in the video talks about how they live their lives, and he's a millennial, through social media. And so celebrities and sports figures were important in those other generations. But basically, you know, maybe Lou Gehrig walked up and gave his speech, and that was the baseball game, and then it went off. For those of you who are old enough to remember, the television went off at midnight and it just played music. Well, for these generations, there's no such thing as television ever going off. There's no such thing as privacy. And even if some stories of celebrities' lives were shared when there was something big going on, this living and breathing in every aspect of a celebrity's life is much greater, much more in depth than any other generation that has had access to celebrities and sports figures. Like on Monday, dislike on Wednesday, off of social media by Friday, right? So all of this connection and what is driving, you know, how I look, what I wear, what I eat, what I buy, what I say, what jobs I go to, the brand image of the place I get hired. All of this is so huge of what's driving millennial behavior. What also happens is interesting is millennials sometimes get a bad rap. People consider them to be negative. But the truth is, when they did the research, the millennials, given everything that they're experiencing, are actually one of the most optimistic and hopeful generations that we have. Yes, they're fast-paced. They're using technology to make a difference in their workspace. They're referring to it more often, you know, using it in ways to move businesses, organizations, nonprofits, foundations forward. This generation is considered one of the best in terms of being a team player because they see team as family. This generation is so attached to parents. It says in there, overindulged by parents. So attached to parents that they are transferring the definition of family at home to family in the workplace. That doesn't mean they want it to be exactly like that. But I said a little earlier, what they're looking for is how does our team function? And is that function similar to how my team functioned called my family? And so this is where when it says they're rule followers and so forth. So in most families, whether ever articulated or not, there are rules in families, right? There are guidelines for behavior. There are guidelines for how we hopefully speak and engage relatives and family. And so what this generation is basically saying, and I say it all the time, I even teach a class called team building, is what are the rules for your team? If I joined your team tomorrow, other than giving me my job description, introducing me to everybody, I show up as a member of a team. What are the rules of the team? Do I get to cut people off? Do I get to use my phone in a meeting? Like, what are the rules of engagement in the team? And what does the team value? Because in a family, we have values and we have rules. On a team, we should have values and we should have rules. Because I can come join your team, bringing all of my baggage from another team into your team. And if you don't tell me what it means to be a member of your team, then I'm going to carry my bag into this. And it may or may not fit what it means to be a team for your team. And so it's so important that we have clarity, particularly for this generation, about what it means to be a member of the team and how that works. And because they are rule followers, those what it means to be a team are those rules that they are actually looking for. There's an old saying that if you do not provide discipline and rules to a child because they have no boundaries, they function in chaos. Well, even if adults are showing up at their job, no rules, no boundaries, I function in chaos. And so there's a need to do that. The thing that I love so much about this generation is that statement about overindulged parents. Most of you might call them or heard of the term helicopter parents. And so as a moment of fun, I'm going to share with you some examples here from the University of Virginia of what a helicopter overindulged parent actually looks like. An overindulged parent at the University of Virginia is the parent that called the Career Center and asked if they could sit in the interview with their child to help them get the job. The overindulged helicopter parent asked if they could call the company because they didn't think their child's salary offer was enough, and they want to go and call the company to negotiate that salary for them to make sure the child gets paid properly. The overindulged parent, helicopter parent, has a child who becomes a nurse and wants to invite the parent to go on their first rounds, violating all HIPAA rules so that they can see the patients that they're going to engage in. And so when parents think, oh, I'm just there to support my child, it shows up very differently when your child shows up at work, shows up in a career center, shows up in these spaces. And on a personal note, I taught an undergraduate class. I taught graduate students, undergraduate students, and I actually got called into the dean's office. A parent wrote a letter to the president of the college and the dean and said, I do not pay Professor Harris's salary for her to have my child do her job. And so that everybody knows what the child was doing, I had all my students stand up and present the chapter. So she didn't even think it was necessary for her child to practice presentation skills or anything that was going to be necessary. She thought her child should just sit still. And so this need to be engaged is lovely, but that overindulgence also sometimes creates a misperception of what it means to be on team. So you know how people always say millennials always want a pat on the back and blah, blah, blah. So that behavior is sometimes driving that other behavior that is showing up on teams, which is again why rules, guidelines, so forth are so important. And telling that to someone is not, oh, I got to give you feedback every day. It's like when I do my one-on-one with you, you'll get your feedback at that time. So understanding this is really important. This is also the first generation where they value diversity and change. If you all remember the young lady, Greta, who stood up at the world event to complain about how the environment is so horrible because we are leaving her generation with the environment that we should have fixed. So this need to be to recognize diversity and equity and inclusion is important to them. So this generation shows up at work and they're looking for those things. They're looking for pay equity, particularly for women. They're looking for the diversity of all ethnicities. They're looking for, does someone show up across the space of accessibility or disabilities issues? As you all notice, I have the closed caption on here, recognizing this generation wants to see inclusion across the board and fairness. What they also want is, don't tell me what my job is. Tell me why it's meaningful. Tell me how it fits into the larger picture of the work that I have to do, because otherwise I'm not sure that it's valuable, right? And so I often say, we have a 2030 strategic plan. You have your own goals, objectives. It's important, and I think this is true for everybody. How does my work have meaning and value? Because then you can coach me toward that more than anything else. Again, they value teamwork. They do want the encouragement. They do want the feedback. And though it says they're good at multitasking, I think from a medical standpoint, nobody's really good at multitasking. We should focus on the thing we're doing, but they feel like they can be on the phone and do something else at the same time. So really important to understand this about them. Okay, I want to move on. This is my picture for the iGen. I love it because there is no real photo that would represent them. Theirs is a technology generation. So Gen Z iGen is also about 20% of the population. They are at this point, in college, and in some cases, some of them are actually working. Their subname is called the post-apocalyptic generation. Everything for them is about planets and destroying things and games and superheroes. But they're also the generation, even more than their counterparts, millennials, who are asking difficult questions. Their generation is going to ask questions about sex. Their generation is going to ask things about the environment. Their generation is going to be the generation that wants to understand why there's still ethnic challenges in our country, right? Their generation wants to fix things because they don't understand, again, why they're stuck with all of these issues that by now we shouldn't have. And this is the generation also from the standpoint of heroes and villains that, again, television and technology. I'm curious, anybody who's seen The Matrix, given the description, brief description I gave, does anybody have any idea why The Matrix might be one of this generation's most favorite movies? You can pop off mute if you have a thought. No wrong answer. Anybody? Give a guess.
The idea of like the constructed world that, I don't know, didn't make sense, wasn't real,
Yes.
didn't have meaning.
Yes, thank you so much, Adam. I appreciate that. Yes, and some of that is that you had good fighting against what they perceive as evil, and so to them, they're the good people who have to address the issues of the evils for which we have left them. And so they are a generation that is struggling because they feel that they are challenged by how society treats each other. Once again, all the ills, the fact that we are still having conversations on ageism and sexism and racism and homophobia. For them, this is like, what's the point, people? This is ridiculous that we are still doing this all these years later. And they are very sensitive. So think about this from a teen standpoint. They are paying attention to everything that gets said or done. Their sense of awareness for inclusion is so much and more important. So when people make comments or jokes, or you're having side conversations, or not everybody goes to lunch, or whatever that could be, they are paying attention to it. By the way, so are millennials, but they are really paying attention to it in this generation, right? This generation is also very close to their parents. They're having some of that parent, watching as well. They are living in games and everything else because that world is controllable and they can manage it better than what they perceive as the real world. They are considered a little less focused because of all the technology, but they do have the ability to shift between work and play. Again, they too want meaningful work. I don't know who doesn't want meaningful work, but it's really important to them that social conscious, again, family structure, they too want feedback. This is why I say no matter what anyone says, everyone who's a supervisor needs to have one-on-ones so everybody gets feedback. HR would tell you that was important anyway, so that would just be critical. And it really matters to them because they want to grow, because they want to know that you're hearing what they say, that you're valuing their perspective, even if they've only been on the job for 6 months. They still have perspective, right? You want to hear this, right? And they care about the need to lead and lead in a different space. Now, with all that being said about this generation, the one thing that is really critical that we need to recognize is this is the first generation in the studies of generations that is not expected to outlive their parents. It is the first generation not expected to outlive their parents. They are not expected to outlive their parents because of suicide, because of drugs, because of alcohol, because of violence in their home and violence in our country. And this is a generation that doesn't see why they should hang around if these are the things they're going to be left with. And at the University of Virginia, this is such a serious issue that the university has created a space for students to go and take yoga, to just relax, to create spaces for them to reduce their stress or their anguish. This is also a generation that has more medication than many other generations as well. So we're managing medicated students on top of the stress of, first of all of them are fantastic students if you came to the University of Virginia because you're a grade point average, but now you got to compete against other people who are just as wonderful as you are. But literally, the suicide rate for this generation is high. And so when we think about, when I said earlier about what it means to be a team, the value of rules, what it means to respect and value people who look like you, who don't look like you, who think like you, don't think like you, who you go to lunch with, but you need to go to lunch with everybody. This is really, really important for this generation. If there was ever a sign that says they're watching you, millennials, but Gen Zs are watching. And they are looking for people who understand the value of inclusion across all the spectrums. And they don't want to be left with this work. And so there are levels of depression and sadness again, and in many cases, millennials otherwise being left with these crazy college student debt, the issues of environment for them, like their whole perception of what they're left with, on top of they got to show up, come to work, and everything else. And some of them are caregivers, is a lot. And so we need to figure out how to bridge the gap by really getting to know and understand these wonderful people who are sitting in this space of challenge. So I thought I'd show you, it's an old slide, I'm gonna hopefully have it updated, but as of 2019, this is what the generations look like at UVA. I know those numbers have adjusted. We have probably more millennials than we do anything else. And I'm sure baby boomers have declined again based on retirement. So again, just so that you can have some idea of what it looks like for UVA. So what I want to do just for a few moments, and this is something you can just write down for yourself. I'm going to ask you to just think of some stereotypes that you yourself have of the various generations, right? What did you think, even before I spoke, what did you think about millennials or Gen Zs? What did you think about Gen Xs or baby boomers or the traditional generations? And I'm just gonna ask you, just write it down. Write down Gen Z. I thought, too much technology. Just take a moment and write down a few of the stereotypes that you believe exist, or maybe they were your experiences that existed with these various generations. Just give you a few seconds, just write them down. Write down at least 3 if you can. 3 different generations or 1 generation and 3 things. Just write down some of the stereotypes that you have of these generations. And I'm going to ask someone, if they don't mind, just come off mute, tell me the generations and what those stereotypes were that you had.
So Lisa, my name is Lorraine. I'll start. So for the Gen Z, the stereotype that they don't reflect on history for decision making. So they think that if it was before they were born, that it doesn't matter. And for baby boomers, I would say that a lot of people stereotype them as that they don't understand technology. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. Yes, 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 yes. Anyone else want to share?
I'll go. I've undone some stereotypes because I've taken the Working Across Generations course taught by Lisa Harris. But I definitely have the stereotype that younger generations want things more immediately, like instant media, quicker answers at work, like text answers rather than email answers, and just that kind of immediacy.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Adam. Always good to see you. Anyone else? These are great.
I'll jump in.
Please.
I'll answer this actually from the auntie standpoint. Millennials, or sorry, Gen Z, I always took it as that entitled generation, though they're willing to work, similar to what he just stated. It's that instant gratification that they're constantly looking for, and not compared to the baby boomers where you work up to those levels.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll take one more if someone else has one. Some burning thought. Thank you, Adam, Lorraine, and Ebony. I appreciate that very much. The reason this is so important is because all of us as human beings walk around with stereotypes. And I'm not saying that we haven't had an encounter that might reinforce it, but the challenge for all of us is when those stereotypes come to mind, is that we have to figure out how to flip them. And so I would ask all of you to consider, for whatever stereotypes that you wrote, is there an advantage? And maybe for some of them, like sometimes people write lazy next to millennials, but often there is a flip side to that, right? And so, the advantage of maybe a baby boomer who is perceived as not understanding or knowing technology is that they know enough from the company or the work that's been done that should technology go out, they might have the knowledge and the history to actually fix something, right? So there's a positive to that, right? And that whole thing about for iGens where they don't know their history, and so nothing beforehand really matters. Maybe the advantage in that could sometimes be that they get to look at something from a different perspective, so that history doesn't block them from being stuck in what was once done. They have a different perspective, right? And so you get that whole thing around gratification, or you even get the entitlement piece. I ask all of you to look at what you wrote and ask yourself, can you convert that to something positive? Because the reason we struggle with generations is because we're stuck most of the time in our stereotypes. So for example, a boomer could actually be more educated in technology than a millennial or Gen Z, because what if the millennial or Gen Z grew up in an area that does not have Wi-Fi? Because we do have parts of this country that don't have access to Wi-Fi, who don't have access to the same technology. And so we're making assumptions. Millennials and Gen Zs make the assumptions, all generations make assumptions and stereotypes. So for us to get better at understanding this, we have got to start thinking about how we came about those stereotypes and what work we need to do to slowly eliminate those stereotypes. And we have them across the board for so many things that they pop up so naturally that literally it happens all the time. In marketing, if you were going to a store, from the moment you see the window until the door is usually 7 seconds. It takes 7 seconds to form an opinion about something. And so in that 7 seconds, you got to work really hard to fall out of your stereotyping, right? Because it's so easy to get into it. And so the more you start flipping, the better that becomes. That takes me to this thing about the 3 A's. Sitting with you today has been more starting us off on awareness, right? And so having that information is so important. Going back and really thinking about your stereotypes and how we think is about awareness. Do I know enough about the person? Do I know enough about their generation? Do I know enough about what might be impacting them? When I started off with some of the Pew research, what's the awareness that you have? I go back to millennials and Gen Zs again on this one. If you have people who work for you, who have 40, 50, 60, 70, $100,000+ in debt, when we go to say, oh, they want to jump around to get another job, could they be jumping because A, they have to pay off $100,000 in debt? It's not because they don't want to sit still or they don't like the job, but do we also know whether or not they're able to take who they're taking care of? So all of this becomes really relevant, because when we go to stereotype, we are missing something about what is going on or transpiring in that person's life. And we need to have built the camaraderie, the teamwork, the values, and the inclusion enough to make sure they get a chance to speak. Then we have to agree on those things that we as an individual and as a team want to do to ensure that we are knowledgeable and we are bridging the gap. That could mean anything from how do you create cross-functional teams across generations. That could mean what events are you doing? If you're the leader of the team, are you spending your one-on-ones, your individual time, getting to know people? Are you putting people together to learn something from each other? Because this is a teaming/family issue, right? And then whatever you agree upon, are you finding things that you all are passionate about? If you're passionate about, the environment, or you're passionate about giving food to people, find the thing that binds you all that is important across all the generations. So you can slowly start to eliminate stereotypes and move into a place where you agree that you can be better, you can think better, you can function better, you can team better, and then you can act in a way that helps you continue to break down these stereotypes. This is an issue of inclusion across all spaces. And since all of us have an age, this is something we all need to be concerned about. Because by the way, under this whole thing of age, I'm going to go to my other slide. This is one of my favorite slides, which is all of us represent all this. This is the intersectionality of all of us. We all have an age. We all have a sexual orientation. We all have some physical disability. We all have gender representation. We all, not race, because by the way, race is a term that was created. We all have ethnicity. Race is what you use on a survey. The truth is we all have an ethnicity. And we all have some representation of spirituality, whether that's no spirituality. And so if we start to look at that, that's us looking at people. And so we're applying the stereotypes. We're either adopting things that other people have said, and we're applying it on a person who represents 6 or 7 of those nodules in that thing. And it is our responsibility to work on our stereotyping and to figure out how to adjust that to coming into an advantage. And this is important because you could be a 30-year-old person working in technology and be too old. You could age out by the time you're 30. You could be a 40-some-odd-year-old woman and age out of the pharmaceutical industry because pretty is defined as 20 to 30. And so now that's your work in pharmaceuticals. By the time you get to 40, you're not so pretty anymore, right? So all of the industries we work in are even stereotyping who fits into work. You could actually have a job for which, unfortunately, the size matters. And so weight becomes another issue. So when people go to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's about inclusion where there is equity and a diverse experience for everybody, which requires us to actually spend time in debunking our own stereotypes so that we can get to a space where we can engage and care about each other. I think I have just one more slide, which is this one. I'm going to stop right here, which is at the end when it says, what does age have to do with it? It has a lot to do with it because our job is to care for each other. All our generations, all the people, and all the cultures matter. And for us to do that and to bridge the gap, we have to start learning more, we have to stretch, and we have to have a willingness to be uncomfortable so that other people can become comfortable. And that just may mean if I'm the millennial and I have something not nice to say about another generation, I need to go and spend time. Because again, that person's not the sum total of their age. If I happen to be a Gen Z who thinks, oh my gosh, Gen Xers, are just disconnected, go spend time. Might they be disconnected because they were on previous teams that weren't involved in inclusion, that didn't demonstrate values? Their negativity is not because they have nothing else better to do, but go learn it. And so I want to encourage everyone to consider that your generations are important, but the people are important. And understanding people's culture is important. And the world is changing. And so in order for us to bridge a gap, we have to first bridge the gap that's in our own head, in our own experiences, and in our own comfort so that we can make room for us to grow and make room for everybody else to grow as well. And so I hope that was helpful to everyone. Thank you for your time.
We'll have a lot of thank yous coming in. I want to give a shout out to everyone who was doing through the chat. There was this great conversation going on in the chat where they were answering everyone was answering their own questions. So that was incredible. Thank you all. That was a beautiful thing to watch. Before we say goodbye, I do want to give everybody a chance that if you do have a question that you want to get in, please don't hesitate. I put a note in the chat too, that if you need to drop off, drop your question there. We'll get it answered. This video is going to be available later this afternoon, so you can watch the end if you have to drop away. Does anyone have any questions that they wanted to ask before we say goodbye? I also wanted to shout out to Amber, who was in here, just phrasing up some awesome little nuggets that you were saying, Lisa, on focus on the positive rather than the negative. Try not to generalize or assume. Effective communication is based on being able to relate to people regardless of cultural, generational, personal differences. Amber, amazing job summarizing that into that space, because it's so true. I loved that. I was like, yes, this can be our new goal for the week. is to do a little takeaway and lean in a little bit and get to know someone that maybe you haven't taken the time to get to know in the past. Maybe this is your week to reach out and to say hello and get to know someone and their story and share yours. So thank you, Lisa, so
Thank you.
much for
Thank
being
you.
here and for talking about age and inclusion with us. Again, thank you to every single one of you again who took time out of the middle of your week to spend. This is incredible. This is what it's all about, spending time together, broadening our mindset, learning new things and seeing things in a different way. Thank you so much to each of you for spending time here with us today. And I am so grateful to each and every one of you. And I hope the rest of your week is wonderful, everyone.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Bye.